I'm Emily Rollie. I teach at Central Washington University in Ellensburg, Washington, KCACTF Region 7. And at Central, I teach theater history, dramatic lit, acting and directing, and then in women and gender studies as well. A response is a fabulous opportunity. I think it's a fabulous opportunity to network, for faculty to see other programs, for students to see other faculty, and for artists to interact with other artists. So it's a great opportunity to have an outside eye, let you know what a response or an experience is of a show, because we get so deep into it as artists that sometimes it's hard to divorce ourselves from what we were intending to do. So it's so wonderful to have a colleague, a fellow artist, someone who supports us to come in and say, here was my experience. I don't know what you intended, but here is my experience, and then we can take from that what we want. And so I think a response is a great moment of feedback, of experience, of another artist talking to a bunch of other artists about their work, to celebrate the work, but then also find ways to perhaps firm up future work. We certainly don't want to change that work in a response, but I think to give us all things to think about as we continue to move forward as artists is a really important piece of the response puzzle. And I think it's a great way for us to see and talk about other programs, for our students to hear about other programs, for our program to hear about other programs, to have this sort of dialogue that so often at the university level we get siloed and kind of stuck in our institution. And so this way, especially as artists, we need that outside force, and this gives us that fabulous opportunity to do that. So I look at it as a response, as an opportunity to interact with other artists in a new space and see new places. It's kind of like, it's your passport to travel somewhere else and see a production and then be able to engage in dialogue. So it's a dialogue, and it's a great opportunity for all of us. I love responding, and it's one of my favorite things to do. Anytime I have the opportunity and time to do it, I will, because I think it's this great, amazing experience to go watch someone else's students and a group of young burgeoning artists do this creative endeavor on stage and bring it to life, and then have a dialogue with them as we would in a collegial professional manner. And so what I think is so awesome and wonderful about responses is that engagement and that dialogue, and being able to see other places. I love going into other institutions and saying, oh, you do theater in a redesigned church. That's amazing. Here are the things inherent to that really strike me. And I love the questions that come from the students and my fellow colleagues as we do responses. I love having those dialogues because it makes you feel a little less alone as an artist and a professor. But it gives us that sense of connectivity. And I love seeing different shows. It's a great excuse to go see a different show or to see a show that you've seen before in a new way. And so it's a really good excuse, selfishly, to get out and see theater somewhere else where you might not get to go otherwise. And so I think that's another thing that makes the response opportunity so awesome. I love being able to see different parts of the region. I think that's a great potential for this as well. But it is really one of my favorite things to do is watch a show and then talk with the artists about it. I think there's a lot for me to learn, and there's a lot for the people I'm talking to gain from it as well. So I think that's what makes it so awesome. It's such a rich experience. It's kind of like peer review, but for performance. And we can send a journal article in and get peer reviewed, but we can't get peer review often in the performative component. So I think it's a really cool way and a more fun way to do peer review in a lot of ways. I think a response can make a huge difference for a student because it makes them feel seen. And it makes their art feel seen, and having an outside eye that is not their professor, it's not their classmate, it's not someone at their institution, say, I see you and I see what you're doing, and here's how I responded to that. I think can be groundbreaking for a student. I think it's also really important for students because it lets them see what other potential there is for their art. Especially as young artists, it's easy to have a one-track sort of focus, and this then encourages them to broaden that focus through the eyes and lens of someone else, another professional. And so it lets them see other people working in the field. I think there's also great networking potential for those students because you talk to them at a different institution and then you see them at festival, or they end up in your part of the region and you happen to run into them and you say, well, I know this person working in this company. So it's a great opportunity for networking for students, grad programs or professionally. But I think at the most core level, for a student to be seen, for their art to really have this weight of someone else responding to it can be momentous and can sometimes be career changing. A first-time lighting designer could have someone respond to their lighting design and say, you have a really good eye for that. And suddenly they, even though the professors have been saying it for however long, they'll still follow that path because someone else has also reaffirmed that. And I think that can be so huge in developing student careers. I think a good response is a dialogue. And most of the time when I start my response, I say, in addition to this is my response as one person in this moment to this one show, I have no idea what your process has been and what you've been through. Once I say that, I usually tell the students and the faculty in the room, I want this to be a conversation because I think a good response is in many ways a conversation. Not just me coming in to say, here's what I saw, but asking questions. And so part of how I structure a response is saying this is my interpretation, purely my experience. And then I try to kind of follow Liz Lerman's critical response process. So offering what was my experience? So this is what I saw, ideally without a ton of judgment, but just this sort of, I saw bright colors. I saw a set that really wanted to be played on. I saw and experienced a really friendly house manager. So for me to structure a response, it's usually talking about the experience and then asking some questions in some capacity, folding that into what was this rehearsal process like for you, or what was it like to play this character, so that there's a dialogue. And then from there, I usually try to offer the sort of, I have recommendations, or I had moments of question that took me out. I use that phrase a lot. This took me out, or this made me wonder. So it's not good or bad inherently. That binary is really hard in a response, but just saying, as an audience member in this moment, my brain went somewhere else. And so I try to structure it that way to make it more of a dialogue and a conversation than a didactic one-way street. I also, in terms of structuring response, try to get on the entire experience. So from when I walk in the door, to when I sit in my seat, to when I read my program, to when I see the show, and to when the show ends. Because I think all of those pieces speak to the larger experience. How your house manager sets up and welcomes you is a big part. Is there dramaturgy in the lobby? That's a big part of it. And so I try to structure my response in terms of how did the whole experience work for me, and what did that tell me, or what did that impression give me? I also try to touch on all of the areas so that everyone, and that's a challenge, but that everyone feels like they've been seen in some capacity. And it might not be a lot, but I think recognizing the work that everyone does is an important piece of the response process. And even as someone who is maybe not a designer, but as a director, I can say, as a director, here's what I wondered about the lighting design, rather than specifically talking about the instruments, because I certainly can't have that conversation, but to offer the lighting designer what my impression was, because I think even our audience gets those impressions. And then in terms of structuring response, I also like to leave room at the end for questions. So if there's things that I've missed, or things that they as an ensemble have been working on, but I may or may not have picked up on, they can voice that, and I can tell them whether I've seen that or not seen that, or what my response is to it. So it's kind of the big pieces of the puzzle in terms of what a response looks like for me and how I want to go at that. For me, it's very dialogic. It's very much about having conversation about this art and telling them what my experience is versus this is good or this was maybe something to work on, because I think that can steer them into wanting to change things. And that's not the job. They've created that with their director and their faculty and their creative team. So I don't see it personally as my job to come in and change anything, but I can offer them my experience that will hopefully help them in the future. And so I think rather than this, I try to steer away from good and bad, but this was effective for me, or this is what I saw, helps sort of steer us in that direction. Yeah. So usually when looking at sort of the strengths and challenges of a performance or a production, that can be a hard balance in terms of when do you offer the critical feedback and when do you bolster certain things. In terms of identifying good or bad, I usually try to say, like, this was effective for me as audience because it made me think this. So I give them something but then explain why I had that interpretation. So if that wasn't how they were intending it, they can make that choice or that interpretation for themselves. If something needs a little more work, we might say, I might suggest to them in future things, you might think about this. So I offer it as a you might think about, or something to keep in mind versus this has to change, because that's so not my job in this particular instance. But I can give them things to think about. And so that's usually how I structure that. Or if it's, I guess I tend to use this more with design elements, but it took me out when this happened. And I wondered about this, so that it's not instructive per se, or prescriptive, I guess, but it's much more a response, but a moment that for me I had a question about that might put us into a conversation creatively on the other side. So it's I wondered about this, or this took me out at a certain moment, just so you are aware. In contrast to this really was effective for me, or this was a powerful moment because of this, this, and this. And I try to be really specific, because I think talking broadly is easy, but really pointing to moments that work is really important for the students because it makes it specific to them. Mm-hmm. I think connecting with the director is an important piece of the puzzle. Usually with the response, there's at least a moment with the director, whether it's dinner or lunch, or I've sometimes had breakfast with them if scheduling doesn't work on that particular day the next morning. But usually it's some sort of conversation so that you can get a sense of what the program is like, what have been the challenges of the show, so you kind of know more of the context, which then can sometimes help temper or change, not change, but perhaps alter some of the way you give feedback. So if you know that, the lead actor was replaced a week ago, that might change how you respond to some of those acting choices. And so those conversations with the director, whether it's a student director or a faculty director, are really important, because I think it helps you contextualize as a respondent. If with student directors, I think is a great pleasure as a respondent, because it's really helping, whether it's an MFA student or an undergraduate student, giving them a sense to talk as a director collegially. So it's a professional one-on-one moment. Sometimes there's a faculty mentor there too, which is great. But to say, what was this production like for you? What questions do you have? Because I think that then gives them a professional step up in the field to have those conversations. Because they did direct this show, so what's the context? What do I need to know? What do you think I need to know? What questions do you have? Because then I can help streamline and feedback to their process as well. With faculty directors, I think the conversation is a big question for me is, what do I need to look for? Or are there certain things you've been working on with this particular group that I should have my eye on? So that you can kind of tag team it, essentially, to back up or to give them that outside feedback if it's something they've been working on. And then in terms of giving the director feedback, I think that feeds through the whole production. So it becomes less about directorial feedback and more about, here's my experience as director, take it for what you will, and then run with it, work with your students. Or tell them that you don't agree with that, and that's okay too. Because I think there's good moments of artists disagreeing, and to have those conversations with students to be like, the respondent saw this. We've been working on this, we're gonna stick to this, and that's okay, because it's one person's interpretation. and this is our interpretation, and that's art, and that's why we do what we do. So I think there's also great merit in offering the questions as respondent, and then as the faculty director to say, that was really interesting, it made me think about things differently, but we're going to follow this path, because that helps our students learn. Yeah, I think when I interact with a director and thinking about trying to read the landscape, the atmosphere of the world I'm entering, both in terms of the production rehearsal room and the production writ large, I think how the director talks about things is really useful. What language that they choose. Sometimes as a respondent, you can tell if there's been a problem in rehearsal by how the director articulates that, and they might not have to say much about it than saying there was a problem in rehearsal, here's how we've dealt with it. Cool. But I know then that there has been a problem, so I can think about how I address some of those things that might be related. So how and what language, they don't have to tell me anything sometimes. You can also, I think, when you talk with directors, get a good sense about what they're proud of, because that's what usually comes first. When you say, what do you want me to look for? And that's the first thing, usually, that comes to the fore. But the talk with the director and kind of reading that language, linguistic interaction, as well as just what they offer is really important. But then I think also too, when you come into the space or you start the response, you can kind of get a sense of the energy of the ensemble. That's an important thing to read, because it tells you how long your response can go. It tells you a little bit about the energy of the ensemble, which is connected to the director, but connected to the ensemble. And you might just get it sounds really ephemeral, but that sort of energetic sense of what's happening in the room to know where you might need to tread lightly. And if you're reading the body language as you're giving the response, you can tell when things land and when they don't. And so if something gets a little prickly, to sort of recontextualize and maybe move away from that. But it's improv. You've got your notes, but it's really reading the room and knowing when you need to push and when you can't. So it's a lot of teaching and it's a lot of improv in that moment, responding to that space. So it's a lot of reading bodies, reading people, and just reading the energy of the space. What makes me feel good about a response is when the students look or say that it has been useful, because I think that's the job, is to offer them things that will be useful to them. Sometimes the effective response is a line of students that have questions or want to talk more in depth. Sometimes the good response is just the energy as the students are like, thank you, that was really useful. But it's knowing and seeing that what you're offering is landing with the students and is useful for them. Whether the response is 15 minutes, they're usually not that short, or if it's 45, it's those conversations and the richness of those conversations. Not every group has questions at the end, and that's okay. When I first started responding, that was my fear, is that if they didn't have questions, it was a terrible response. I've learned that that's not true. Sometimes they just need to sit with it. So it's usually looking at their faces and getting a sense of how they're leaving the space and having those final conversations of, thank you, this was useful. But knowing that it's useful for those students, that you can see them take it in, or frantically jotting notes, or nodding along with you, or even sometimes quizzically looking at you because it means they're processing. And I think that to me is an effective response because it's getting them to think about their artistic choices.